I think it's fair to say that we're spoiled for choice when it comes to gaming keyboards. But feel and creaminess aside, new functionality, innovation, and game-changing features are relatively few and far between. After all, there's not much you can do to innovate pressing a key, right? Well, not quite. In this review, I'll be taking a look at the Razer Huntsman V3 Pro, a keyboard packed with innovation that promises, guarantees, legitimately game-changing features, including one or two that are so effective that the use of them has been outright banned in some games. And if none of what I just said hyped you up to see this thing in action, nothing will. But before we dive into all of that, if you decide to buy anything featured in any of my videos, doing so via my affiliate links in the description down below is a great way to help support the channel and the work I do here. But if you can't or don't want to, just watching the video is more than enough. Now, unless this is somehow the first review you watched of the Huntsman V3 Pro, you'll know that the major selling point is Razer's second generation analog optical switches. And while they do ship with a few neat features of their own, we've actually had analog switches for a while now. A class of switches that I think have done more for the performance of gaming keyboards than anything else in recent memory. Now, as the name would suggest, and without getting too technical about it, analog optical switches use light beams to register the position and actuation of key presses, rather than relying on mechanical contact points like mechanical boards. This enables the switches to measure exactly how far a key is being pressed, allowing for more granular control like that of a controller's analog sticks. It also, along with a few other cool tricks, allows you to adjust the point at which a key press is registered, with the V3 Pro letting you dial that point in to anywhere between 4mm and an insane 0.1mm. All of that and more should result in some of the most accurate and responsive feeling keyboard switches ever made. And of course, it's these switches that enable Razer's rapid trigger mode and the controversial snap tap feature that stole headlines. But more on that later. In contrast to its fancy, intricate switches, the Huntsman V3 Pro is a refreshingly unassuming keyboard. Devoid of little screens, random accent colors, rows and rows of macro keys, each destined to be used precisely once, and there's even a stark lack of branding almost throughout. Well, other than the Razer branding on the side, and the Razer slogan plastered all over the back of the board. But hey, even those aren't too obnoxious. The V3 Pro is a very tame looking board, going by gaming keyboard standards anyway. The black brushed metal top plate has a really great texture to it that adds a lot to the board's premium look, one that's accentuated even more by the board's double-shot PBT keycaps, which come with their own unique texture and thankfully a distinctly non-gamery font choice. The board has a more grown-up vibe to it that probably won't make it the center of attention on your desk, and there's part of me that really likes that. I also like that when the lights go out, all that goes out of the window because Razer is still Razer, which means that the lighting quality of the V3 Pro is excellent. Every key, button, and dial gets its own addressable north-facing RGB LEDs that can go as dim or as bright as you want them to. They're diffused super well, which, along with the somewhat anti-reflective finish of the top plate, almost makes the keys seem like they're floating in a sea of glorious RGB. The V3 Pro passes the RGB vibe check, but similar to certain tech reviewers, what the board doesn't quite pass is the weight check. The V3 Pro is surprisingly light for a full-size mechanical board. Luckily, the V3 Pro's lack of heft doesn't seem to take anything away from the overall build quality. Thanks to that metal top plate, the board has very minimal flex and no part of the plate or plastic housing feels unrefined or fragile. Though purely from a premium feel perspective, I do wish we got some weights in this particular fish.
We got weights and fit! There we go!
Even though the board ships with a high-quality Type-C cable, Razer opted not to add USB pass-through to the board, a feature which I use all the time for my wireless dongles and the like. Not a deal breaker, of course, but it's worth mentioning. Also worth mentioning is that the V3 Pro has 3 dedicated media buttons along with a dial in the top right. Neither the buttons nor the dial sound or feel all that satisfying to play around with, but they're essential add-ons to me, and even more so considering that you can customize their functionality. One thing that's not essential for me is a dedicated handrest, which is a good thing because the one included with the V3 Pro sucks. It's way too firm, the magnets that keep it attached to the board aren't particularly strong, and it just feels cheap. Now, although the Huntsman V3 Pro is almost exclusively targeted at pro gamers, it also handles being, a mechanical keyboard well, though not without a learning curve. I wasn't expecting my typing experience on such a gamer-centric board to be all that special, but I was pleasantly surprised. Because I type on my keyboards a lot more than I game on them, I prefer switches with a slight tactile bump. Think Cherry MX Browns. That seemingly put the V3 Pro's linear analog optical switches at an immediate disadvantage. But after just the first hour of playing around with the board, I found myself really enjoying the smooth feel of each key press. The Gen 2 switches Razer cooked up here are probably the smoothest I've ever felt on a keyboard. This is in large part thanks to the very light 40-gram actuation force required by the switches. And even though it probably doesn't directly contribute as much to their smoothness per se, the stabilizer strapped to each key made every key press feel, well, more stable. All of that in combination with whatever inner mechanisms Razer stuffed into these things didn't leave me longing for my other boards or brown switches much at all. And even though this is entirely subjective and not even worth mentioning, my very first typing experience on the board improved my words per minute score by more than a few notches. That was, however, with a few more errors than usual, which brings me to that learning curve part. If you buy this board, don't know how analog switches work, and aren't prepared to configure them via the shortcuts or via Razer Synapse, typing on the V3 Pro could be a little frustrating. For whatever reason, just review unit things, this particular board had its actuation point defaulted to a ludicrous 0.1 millimeters. That, along with the 40-gram actuation force, meant that even just resting my fingers on the typing row was registering presses. I was typing at blazing speed, while also making more typos than that one time I mistook my pre-workout with some other nondescript powder. But once you learn the built-in shortcuts to configure all of that, which shouldn't take too long thanks to the helpful LED array above the direction keys, you won't run into those issues. Oh, and most of those settings can be saved directly to the keyboard itself, so you won't need to rely on Synapse for everything, which is a bonus. Unfortunately, the buttery smoothness of the switches wasn't something that quite carried over to the board's overall sound signature. Sure, the V3 Pro still sounds better than the majority of gaming keyboards, it's just that the board has a slightly higher pitch to its key presses than I prefer, and even though the stabilizers on the larger keys sound a lot better than most, they and the rest of the keys just aren't on the same level as many custom boards out there. Yep, definitely a decent sounding gaming keyboard. But again, we're still a ways off from gaming keyboards sounding close to as good as the beautiful abominations custom keyboard enthusiasts dream about. And speaking of dreams, I never dreamt of any keyboard being as good for gaming as the Huntsman V3 Pro is. This is by far the fastest, most accurate, most responsive, most gaming oriented, and frankly the most fun board I've ever used. And that goes for all the games I tested on it. Regardless of the game I was playing, whether it was 100%ing my RPGs, micromanaging every aspect of my people's lives in Manor Lords of Frostpunk 2, or trying to convince myself that my reflexes are still passable enough to dominate in FPS titles, the V3 Pro improved both my perceived performance and fun levels in all of them. The light actuation force, a dialed-in actuation point, and the inherent low latency advantage enabled by the switches, apparently as low as 1.7 milliseconds, made my inputs significantly faster than on any other board. All of my actions felt more accurate and as true to my intent as possible. And while I don't play any hardcore racing games, driving around in Cyberpunk with almost the same level of precision offered by like a controller made that and other games that benefit from analog controls that touch more immersive. Now, as I mentioned twice before in this video, games I do play, unfortunately for my sanity, include sweaty shooters like Apex, Overwatch, Warzone, Valorant, and occasionally some Fortnite. And it's here where the Huntsman V3 Pro 360 no-scopes itself ahead of the pack. Most of these shooters benefit significantly from fast, precise, snappy, and responsive inputs to play at a higher level. You know, any level higher than I'm at. Well, as you probably gathered by now, the V3 Pro enables all that and more. Along with all the features we've already dug into, like adjustable actuation points, the V3 Pro also includes Razer's Rapid Trigger and Snap Tap functionality, both of which are powerful tools on their own, but elevate performance even more when used in tandem. The former, Rapid Trigger, is a mode that lets you choose at exactly what point a key press is reset. This means that instead of having to release a key beyond a fixed reset point for it to register another key press, you can essentially tell the key to reset as soon as you start releasing it, letting you spam said key faster than on almost any other keyboard. And then SnapTap comes in to make key spamming even more effective. SnapTap is a feature that tells the keyboard to prioritize the last input you pressed, even if you're already pressing something else. On regular boards without SnapTap, if you hold down the A or D key and press the opposing key, they cancel each other out and your character freezes. With SnapTap, you can hold down either key, tap the opposite one, and the board will switch between them instantly. With these two combined, things like movement accuracy penalties are cut down as much as possible, and god-tier counter-strafing becomes almost second nature. Picking up loot in Apex or Warzone, building in Fortnite, and especially counter-strafing movements in Overwatch all felt significantly faster, twitchier, and smoother. And even though SnapTap isn't nearly as overpowered in Valorant as it was in Counter-Strike before it got axed, I still felt like it gave me a slight edge. And that's kind of the whole thing here. Feel. I'm not a pro in any of the games I play, so I won't sit here and honestly tell you that the Huntsman V3 Pro is guaranteed to improve your KD ratio, or get you more dubs. But what I can say is that it feels like it could. It made me feel like I was playing better, even if in a lot of cases it was only by a tiny bit, and more than actually being better, feeling like I was playing better upped the fun factor for me by a lot. And I think that's the biggest selling point here. I'm also convinced that if I were somewhat competent in any of the games I play, I would get significantly more bang for my buck with the V3 Pro. And speaking of bucks, this is where we're snapped back to reality, because the Huntsman V3 Pro unfortunately commands an equally pro price. The full-size version we're working with today lands at a hefty $250 or around 5,500 Rand here in South Africa, while the similarly capable TKL and 60% mini versions come in at $220 and $180 respectively. This means that whichever version of the V3 Pro you're looking at, it'll be close to, if not the most expensive analog board in its size class. Well-known manufacturers like Wooding, Logitech, SteelSeries, Glorious, Turtle Beach, Ducky, and a few others have their own analog boards that sports very similar functionality to the V3 Pros, and in most cases won't hit your wallet nearly as hard. And on top of that, a handful of lesser-known brands are demanding even less of a premium for their analog boards. Sure, most of the options I just mentioned opt for a Hall effect rather than optical switches, but even though they use different methods, both switch types essentially enable the same analog control. Oh, and let's not forget that regular mechanical keyboards aren't going anywhere, and can usually be had for significantly cheaper than analog boards. While my time with the Huntsman V3 Pro was exceptional, I by no means think that everyone should go out and buy one. On the one hand, I really love this thing. I think it looks great, Razer's lighting is always superb, it feels and sounds at least as good as most premium gaming boards out there, and all of the functionality that comes with the optical analog switches made it the most fun board I've ever gamed on, and probably one of the best gaming keyboards ever made. But on the other hand, in my opinion, I don't think these boards provide enough to justify their asking price, at least not for the majority of gamers. If you're playing competitive games at a pro level, you should absolutely consider picking one up. If you spend most of your time playing sweaty competitive shooters, then there's definitely an argument to be made there too. And, of course, if you just want the best of the best or very close to it and don't mind the price, then what are you waiting for? But if none of that applies to you, you probably don't need this board. There are cheaper options that'll net you a very similar experience, and there are options that feel better, sound better, are less finicky, and ones that'll probably fit your actual needs much better. But hey, if you do end up getting one, you'll probably love it. And that wraps it up for this one. If you like this video, let me know, and remember to use my affiliate links below if you want to grab some new gear and support the channel and the work I do here while you're at it. And yeah, I'll see you all in the next one. Cheers.